So let's get started. A warm welcome to all of you to our CSS Web Talk on the current war in the Middle East. My name is Daniel Möckli and I'm heading the think tank at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. The CSS is a center of competence for international and Swiss security policy engaged in academic research, education and policy consultancy. Our think tank covers a broad range of security issues, from peace promotion and mediation to new technologies and defense. And we also cover issues of international order and dynamics in geopolitical theaters. And it's in this context that today we seek to take stock of the current war in the Middle East. Some call it the Iran war, others the Gulf War. Yet others again, the Israeli-American war against Iran, and this variety of labels already indicates that there are very different readings out there as to what is going on. Now, 4 weeks into this war, what we clearly see is that this is a regional security crisis with profound global consequences. And it is yet another major crisis development advancing the demise of the rules-based international order. As the situation is fluid at the moment, we will not focus on daily events in this web talk, but rather attempt to understand the broader regional dynamics and global strategic implications of what we are seeing. And I'm fortunate to be able to present to you three excellent experts on these matters. And I start with Dr. Sanam Vakil. She is director of the Middle East and North African program at Chatham House. Her expertise spans Iranian and Gulf politics, regional security dynamics, US foreign policy, and the greater strategic landscape as it is evolving in the Middle East. Good to have you. Thank you for joining us, Sanam. Then we have Grace Wermenbold, Dr. Grace Wermenbold. She is a senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund and a senior fellow at the The Hague Center for Strategic Studies. And previously, she was a Middle East specialist in the State Department and also worked in other US government agencies. Hello, Grace. Thank you for joining us. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Gorana Girgic, my colleague from the Center of Security Studies. She is head of the global security team in our think tank and also the main editor of our annual flagship publication, Strategic Trends, that was just published and focuses on regional and global order issues this year. I'm grateful to all three panelists for joining us. Now, we will start our discussion in a second, but let me just inform the audience that you are welcome to send questions through the Q&A function. We will have a team here in Zurich that collects these questions, puts them into some clusters. It's anonymous, so then no names will be shown, and we will pose these questions to our panelists in about 45 minutes or so, before we then finally will wrap up with an outlook of what's ahead. So without further ado, let me get started, and I would like to get started with you, Sanam. By taking a closer look at Iran today. We see numerous leading figures killed. We see Iran's military system significantly weakened, but there's no regime change signs at this stage, no Kurdish uprising, as was discussed some weeks ago. And what we do see, by contrast, is what many analysts call some fairly successful asymmetric warfare, raising the cost of war. So where would you see Iran today, and what's your assessment of regime stability at this stage?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be with you, Daniel, and also with other colleagues on the call. So just to answer your question on Iran, we're over a month into this war, and the regime has come to this war on February 28th very prepared. Why were they prepared? Because as a result of last summer's 12-day war, I think they were acutely aware that without anything beyond a ceasefire, with no agreement on the table between themselves and the Trump administration, they very much risked a return to a war, particularly with Israel, but also with the United States. And so they began planning for this war actually much earlier than clearly the Israelis or the Americans did, because they came to this war with plans plans. And what were those plans? Obviously, a military strategy that is horizontal, that's attritional, that is meant to transfer the costs of the war from beyond Iran to the region, but also to broader investors and energy consumers globally. But also to be able to survive what would be a degradation campaign or decapitation campaign imposed by Israel and the United States. And so how did they prepare? Certainly they were aware, as last summer was a preview to what we're living through now, that highest echelons of leadership would be eliminated. And of course, on February 28th, the supreme leader and much of his family was taken out. And we have seen a very senior leadership also killed over the past few weeks as well. How Iran has responded is the way an institutionalized and bureaucratized regime would respond. It's not a personalistic system. They've gone through their processes, and their processes have produced promotions for people who sit below. Indeed, a new supreme leader was selected, one that wasn't really expected to emerge, but is a result of, he is a wartime supreme leader, and as a result of this war, we have someone who is hardline, we have a hereditary figure, Mojtaba Khamenei. And so for the time being, while the war is very much underway, I see this system as resilient and prepared to continue to resist. Their aim is to survive this war. And, you know, as a secondary but very important objective, they're also trying to obtain an agreement that protects them from further strikes and further wars, but also enables them to rehabilitate internally through economic sanctions relief, perhaps, or what they themselves call reparations. So for now, they are okay. And again, it's because of the institutional structures and processes. But it doesn't mean that they won't face challenges once this war comes to an end. And to me, it's rather obvious that the war doesn't produce a rally around the flag effect, but very clearly there are no protests or challenges or elite fragmentation within a system that is unified for a specific cause. The fragmentation and the political challenges can emerge in the so-called day after, particularly if there is no economic off-ramp, or if there are no reparations for Iran, or if there is no agreement. Then certainly all of the concerns, all of the grievances that Iranians have held against this regime, be them political, be them in terms of governance, be them on economic issues, are certainly going to be there, magnified by 10. And so protests will reemerge. And this system, as it survives, is definitely going to be more insular. It's definitely going to be more technocratic as well as militaristic in its formation. We don't know what sort of role the supreme leader will take or what sort of ideas he will put forward, once the war comes to an end, and should he survive that war. But for the time being, this is how I see it. It's the day after, like in most authoritarian regimes, and like in Saddam Hussein's regime after the 1991 Gulf War, that political challenges emerged. But he even held on from 1991 to 2003. So I also don't expect huge momentous unrest for a system that it continues to be willing to exert brute force against its people.
Thank you. So well prepared, resilient, with an uncertain future the day after. If we stay with the regional dynamics and change a bit the perspective and look at the GCC countries, by attacking them, Iran has sort of also attacked the economic and security foundations of the US-led regional order. And in your assessment, I guess they were less prepared than Iran, but I'm curious to hear you on this. But how are they adjusting in your assessment finding themselves almost at the center of a war? And what are the prospects for them and their business model at this stage?
So the Gulf states were as prepared as they possibly could be for this war. The reality is that I think the Gulf states will emerge from this war very exposed and fragile. Not because they haven't, to the best of their abilities, marshaled the defense to the persistent barrage of drones and missiles coming over all of the countries of the GCC. And here it's worthwhile just reminding your viewers that prior to the war on February 28th, the Gulf was collectively and individually lobbying the Trump administration against such a military campaign. They had, for a number of years now, pursued a rapprochement or normalization with Iran. They saw this diplomatic relationship management as the best way forward. And were keen to avoid a war because they knew very well that such a war this time round would have serious damage and spillover effects. And for the GCC, particularly for the UAE, but also to a certain degree, and for Qatar, but also to a certain degree for Saudi Arabia, the war has punctured the image of the Gulf states as a safe haven for your holidays, for your capital, for airline travel, for transit from one part of the globe to another. And so what will be very important for the Gulf states emerging from this war is also securing some sort of arrangement that guarantees no more war. And this war has also, to a certain degree, brought the Gulf states together in their, intra-GCC, intra-Gulf conflicts that have been percolating for a number of years now. But ultimately, the Gulf feels very frustrated that their diplomatic strategy with Iran didn't work, that President Trump, perhaps didn't provide adequate protection for the Gulf states, and that the U.S. president didn't anticipate. If we talk about the Iranians being prepared, we can certainly say that the Trump administration came to this war not as prepared. They had prepared for a limited military campaign, and they had not prepared for the known unknowns of this war, which would be Iran's response, Iran's ability to resist, and that Iran would strike the Gulf states quite widely. And this was readily acknowledged as fact, I think, among the analytical community, but the Iranians themselves had sort of made it clear of what their strategy would be. So, the Gulf states, again, are very vulnerable, and they recognize that the U.S., they collectively and independently had invested in their relationship with the Trump administration. They welcomed President Trump 2 times now to the Gulf. They celebrated his trip last year. They thought, finally, the era of U.S.-sponsored regime change is over. They invested back into the U.S. economy, $1.4 trillion, supposedly from Saudi Arabia. And simultaneous to that, they were also pursuing these incremental normalization tracks, specifically the UAE and Bahrain with Israel. And effectively, they emerged from this war with normalization with Israel having, led to destabilization in Gaza and politicizing their populations, normalization with Iran not having materialized with anything meaningful, the United States, their security guarantor, basically compromising their security. So, I think they're in a very difficult bind, and thinking about how those countries and relationships, rebuild, particularly their image, will be very much predicated on broader regional stability and drawing down and settling a lot of these conflicts that have been left to fester for quite some time in the Middle East.
Thank you. So you read a lot, I guess, analysis these days that in the Gulf, that the US is prioritizing Israel's security over GCC security. So these are difficult dynamics for the Gulf, and certainly something we will continue to watch. If we now move to the US, turn to the US-Israeli war alliance, and bring in Grace on this, I mean, it's sort of impressive how closely aligned operationally this war alliance is functioning. I can't recall any similar operation in recent years with such a close coordination of the militaries, and there's a lot of tactical gains, but where would you assess today strategically this war alliance is? There's very conflicting analysis of whether it holds or whether the divergences are growing. So I'm curious to hear your reading of where this US-Israeli cooperation stands at the moment.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. In terms of where the War Alliance stands today, I think before getting into that, it's relevant to just really highlight kind of what you implicitly referred to, Daniel, the uniqueness of this War Alliance before moving on. So I think it's clear that while the U.S. has provided Israel military aid, intelligence, and diplomatic support for decades, and has also coordinated with Israel on covert operations. When Israel and the U.S. commenced their war in Iran last month on February 28, it really was the first time that the two countries engaged in a joint military offensive against another country. Being said, as you also alluded to, there are important divergences in how Israel and the U.S. Are approaching this war. And some of these divergences have actually been present from the very beginning. I published a piece about a week ago on how Israel under Netanyahu and the U.S. under Trump have had divergent objectives in this war. And to a certain extent, this is ideological. For Netanyahu, this war has really been focused on securing some sort of regime change through decapitating its leadership that would allow a solution to the nuclear program in Iran. And this has really been a through emphasis of his foreign policy over the last few decades. And I will also add that in the post-October 7th landscape, securing a new regional reality has taken on an added importance for Netanyahu. Part of that is that he wants to go into the upcoming Israeli elections with a new narrative. He doesn't want to present himself as the leader who oversaw a dreadful security failure on October 7th. He wants to be able to say that he was the one who was leading Israel in dealing with the security threats across the region, and that's true for Iran and other places as well, like Lebanon. And I think for Trump, the calculus is very different. His daily wavering between objectives, timelines, and desired outcomes, in my view, really underlines his lack of ideological commitment to this war. And I would also say that if you look at the U.S. and Israel, they've also demonstrated a difference in operational approach to this war that I think itself is driven by diverging concerns and interest. To put it maybe somewhat more generally, there appears to be more of a cohesion in the alliance's targeted military infrastructure than on issues such as civilian energy infrastructure, and also, of course, what kind of Iran is left behind. So in terms of where we are today, I think it's fairly evident that Trump, unlike Netanyahu, is looking for an exit out of this war. He recently extended a self-imposed deadline on striking Iranian energy targets to enable more room for mediation until next week. And I would even argue that the threat of escalation, the additional troops that we've seen move to the region, the additional military power that we've seen move to the region should be viewed in this context, what the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called escalate to de-escalate. So that's how I'm looking at the alliance today.
So let's look at it both from a Trump perspective and from an Israeli perspective in terms of the remaining policy options on the table. We have heard the unease of GCC countries, the resilience of Iran. If you look a bit closer at different US policy options at this stage and what they might imply also in the longer term for the Trump foreign policy, perhaps also domestically, how would you assess these policy options at this stage?
Yeah, I think there's two tracks that we're really seeing play out at the same time. One is what has, I think, been referred to as quite accurately as the positioning that's currently taking place between the US and Iran through the Pakistanis, this attempt to see if there's the potential for a mediated off-ramp. A 15-point proposal, US proposal, was reportedly delivered to the Iranian officials. That included demands such as reopening the Strait of Hormuz, an end to regional proxy support, and handing over enriched uranium. Not wholly different from some of the mediations that were taking place prior to this war. But then there's the other track that I mentioned, which is very much focused on ramping up the military pressure on Iran, albeit during an already active war. So as I mentioned, additional troops and military material have been moved or are on their way to the region. So last Tuesday, the Pentagon ordered some 2,000 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division to begin moving to the region, in addition to 2 Marine units. So in total, the number of American troops is currently estimated at about 50,000. So that's 10,000 more than usual, but it still is considered the largest military buildup since 2003. And then in terms of potential further escalatory moves, I think there's 3 that are most likely in the near term. The first, which has been, I think, mentioned previously, is the seizing or blockading of Hark Island, potentially in combination with clearing Iran's coastline to help open the Strait of Hormuz, which is about 500 kilometers south of the island. And of course, as I'm sure everyone is aware, Hark Island is a key fuel hub for Iran. It handles about 90% of the oil exports. So the attempt here would really, or the goal here would really be to apply economic pressure on the regime, which broadly has been able to export oil since the beginning of this conflict. The second escalatory move could involve attempts to secure safe passage through the strait, which could involve taking control over or trying to take control over several strategically positioned islands around the strait, including 3 islands called Abu Musa, Greater Thumb, and Lesser Thumb. And the third escalatory option is of course a special military raid that could be focused on securing Iran's nuclear material. There's reportedly still some 450 kilograms of enriched uranium inside Iran, and a military raid could involve digging that out. Again, this is a very complex operation. I personally don't see it happening, but the idea would be to dig it out and somehow transport it out of the country. In terms of your question on the repercussions for domestic policy, I think it's important to note that this is not a popular war in the U.S. Recent polling suggests that over half of Americans oppose this war, and it certainly hasn't helped with recent approval ratings for Trump, which stand at -18, according to The Economist. With that being said, the opposition to this war, or their perspectives on this war, do fall mostly along party lines. So Republicans and MAGA, for those individuals who identify such a much more popular war. So even though I think it's clear that this war is in direct contradiction with notions of non-interventionism, nation building, and also those kind of issues that have been put forward by this administration, we're not seeing the ramifications of that irony yet show up in the polls. But what I will say is that the war's impact on the U.S. economy, I do think is a reason why Trump is looking for an off-ramp. The National Security Strategy last year was published in October 2025. It highlighted one of the reasons that the U.S. no longer needs to prioritize conflict in the Middle East. And it said one of the reasons was that the U.S. had become a net energy exporter. The problem, of course, from the U.S. perspective is that oil prices are set globally. So even if the U.S. is not as reliant on the Gulf for energy imports. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz does end up mattering to the US. So for instance, in terms of like very concretely the price of gas, we've already seen it rise from $3 to $4, and there's a potential for it to rise even further to $5. And I do think the increase in price, in addition to just broadly the cost of this war, is important for Trump and the White House. Midterms are scheduled for later this year, and already we've seen across special elections in the U.S. that the Democrats are likely going to be doing well. The other thing I'll note is, of course, even prior to this war, the question of affordability was key for U.S. voters. And so if in a war where gas prices are going up, and that, of course, has further effects on prices across goods and products in the U.S. economy, that's going to be hugely important for the U.S. voters and, of course, political leaders.
Thank you. So to close perhaps this first round on the regional dynamics, Sanam, if you hear Trump rather keen on a mediated off-ramp while also having some military options still, what's your assessment from an Iranian perspective? Is there a similar priority of moving towards a mediated off-ramp, or how do you assess their perceptions?
Well, I think that the Iranians are looking at this situation and caught really up in a few things. First of all, there is about zero trust in President Trump, who has 2 times now lured everyone along with this mirage of diplomacy. I, for one, don't take anything he says seriously, and I can pretty much tell you there are no direct talks taking place. So, if people are trying to manage this situation to enable the president to get out of a poorly executed war that is having, global consequences, that's certainly happening. But the Iranians are clearly not being lulled into a third round of negotiations, knowing full well that President Trump is still moving ground troops into the region, talking about, landing in Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz, these sort of magical ideas of taking islands. They're prepared for it, is what I suspect. They're not going to be able to respond in conventional ways, obviously, but they will be looking to impose cost, political cost, human cost, economic costs on this administration in terms of their retaliation. But I suspect that they're also, flirting with the possibility of what negotiations would result in, for no other reason that they need a negotiation to get out of this situation that they're in. And the Iranian system certainly can withstand a war for longer than President Trump, really, because it is an authoritarian system. But and their economy, of course, is very fragile. But and they have prepared for a longer campaign. But what they risk doing is overplaying their hand and not taking the off-ramp when presented to them. But the president's 15 demands and Iran's 5 demands are both very maximalist. And what you have to arrive at is something that is achievable. I think the 2 biggest objectives for the Iranians, or maybe 3, obviously the war has to end with an agreement. It can't just be a Trump self-imposed, I'm done, thank you very much, back to the rest of the world to handle the problem. 2, they need an agreement that's verified and monitored by a broader community of whether it's a coalition of the willing or whether it's a UN Security Council resolution. Their objective is to prevent a third Iran, Israel, US conflagration. So having this agreement guaranteed by external actors will be very important. And that's very hard to achieve in this fragmented, multi-aligned world of today. And then thirdly, they're looking for the so-called reparations. I don't see, obviously compensation coming to the Iranians, but, I take their terminology of reparations to mean either some degree of sanctions relief, access to their foreign assets that are being held abroad, and of course, this new revenue stream that they have recently acquired that they didn't have over a month ago, which is, the sort of toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz. So they're going to be looking to build out a scenario that gives them economic resilience, which is important for the domestic dynamics at home. But I take all of this. This could be an opening round of negotiations. Or last week he also, tried to walk back some of his bad ideas by, suggesting that there were negotiations underway. What's really interesting to me is that this group of regional states, none of whom, are thrilled or enthralled with the Islamic Republic, from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Turkey and Pakistan, recognize that a deal is urgent now in this small window, because the spillover of a U.S. landing on Iran is going to be monumental. And Iran's escalation ladder, still hasn't fully played out. They could, the Houthis, sort of foreshadowed last week that they have intent to get into the war. They've only targeted Israel for now. But I fully suspect if the United States does go through door number one, the escalation to de-escalation ramp, that's where the Houthis begin to take a much more overt posture, repeating what we saw in the Bab el-Mandeb, and that is what is going to finally lead to the big bounce in stock markets and energy prices.
So this leads us into the more international, global perspective on what's going on in the Middle East. You mentioned the importance of external guarantees, perhaps security guarantees. That's quite a challenge in itself. And that leads me to bring in Gorana, and also to focus a bit on external actors. I mean, we could discuss lots of topics, but if we stick with actors for the moment and start with the allies and partners of the US, how are Western allies and partners responding to this situation in your assessment, Gorana? How do you assess alliance cohesion and the whole impact on the so-called West of what's happening right now in the region?
Yeah, I would start answering this by just framing it with two thoughts, and that's that United States doesn't have just a geopolitical advantage in having a great military, and we've seen the tactical successes, but in theory, the web of alliances that it has forged throughout decades should be something that exactly this moment would be a source of strength that it could draw on, right? But and this is an important but, all of this is happening at the time when we have seen a sort of alliance environment that's been politically strained to the point that we are way past the sort of traditional narratives about, some passing crisis in transatlantic relations or questions swirling around the US commitment to its allies in the Indo-Pacific and so on. So these are the two things I really think we should keep in mind. There is, in theory, the wealth of this sort of support, but we haven't seen it play out for this particular reason, which has been the sort of ongoing pattern of Donald Trump's stance towards allies. So what we have seen so far, and I think this is a kind of cross-theater story from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, is that allies are not lining up behind any kind of war effort or war project. They are lining up behind crisis containment, especially when it comes to the economic fallout. So all of the messages we've heard so far have been around no to any kind of military mission because A, we haven't been consulted on this, right? B, we don't know what the strategic objectives are. C, we don't know what the exit strategy is. We are all left in sort of this web of uncertainty. And we also haven't heard on the sort of diplomatic side any kind of pushes to insert themselves in the kind of mediation that you just alluded to, and where some of the main actors are now, Pakistan or Egypt or maybe Turkey to an extent that would be maybe adjacent to something that NATO could be involved in, but not in this institutional way. So the trend, the strongest sort of pattern that I have observed at least has been around crisis management and defining the terms of participation around risk minimization. And so, what we've seen over the past couple of weeks in Europe have been some of the proposals from France, Germany, United Kingdom that have to do with basically some sort of operation that would be a mission on the day after all of this ends, right? Maritime security once conditions allow that, but overall the messaging is around de-escalation, around the need to protect shipping routes and sort of diversify sources around economic stabilization. And then the further you move away and the kind of towards the latter sort of ends of the supply chains into the Indo-Pacific, and specifically, countries that are very vulnerable and left really now in dire straits because of the energy crisis they are facing from Japan all the way to Australia. We've heard a lot more of this talk that is these days almost reminiscent of the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have a lot of the kind of crisis management, national emergency, to the point that we have seen in the Philippines, for instance, another US treaty ally, which has actually been the first country to declare the state of emergency due to the energy shock, given that it basically imports nearly 90% of its hydrocarbons. So in that sense, in terms of the allied support, we can talk about only in the kind of rhetorical backing for objectives like decapitating the leadership, but we've replaced one Ayatollah with the next one, and then overall either hesitation or outright pushback against any kind of involvement that would involve a military role for allies and partners.
So perhaps in the Q&A, we can discuss what that could mean for the longer term prospects also of the transatlantic alliance, the Middle East being often a source of tension, but perhaps never the make or break situation that some are seeing right now. But if for the moment, we turn the perspective from allies to more the competitors and the rivals, how do you see major powers responding to this crisis? How do you assess their roles and their position? I'm talking specifically about Russia and China, but any other country you want to bring in as well. And how do you assess the implications of their behavior for both European security and the Indo-Pacific? So these other geostrategic arenas that are all increasingly connected.
Yeah, this is the sort of my bread and butter of the interconnectedness of theaters, which I think in this case is something that we are seeing play out in a way that wasn't necessarily the way that people would have gamed it out, particularly given, again, the changing stance of the US administration surrounding some of the other theaters, again, and commitment to resolving either Russia's war against Ukraine or, again, commitments to the East Asian allies. So I would frame this primarily through the kind of concept of what sort of opportunity structures this has created for Russia in particular, and to an extent to China. So we've seen now plenty of analysis out there that say that Russia is a clear sort of short-term winner from this, and I would wholeheartedly agree with this, because Russia was truly not doing well if you think about its revenues from exports of hydrocarbons hitting the sort of lowest point since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So in the early months of this year, throughout the kind of Q1 until the war started in late February, basically Russia was starting to feel a lot of the pinch from both the sanctions that were imposed on it, but also from the targets that have been hit within Russian territory, being some of these oil refineries and similar. So it has definitely gained some breathing ground, given that we've seen the surge in price of oil on the global market. So now there are some, again, speculations when it comes to where this price can go. So Brent crude climbing and even surpassing the sort of records that were set back in 2008 with the onset of global financial crisis. and sovereign debt crisis that has created. In that sense, a relief, temporary for sure, for Russia's coffers, but then also some other benefits, which were, of course, the US unilateral relief of sanctions, some of the sanctions against Russia when it comes to its hydrocarbons. And then, of course, what Russia is definitely benefiting from is the fact that attention, just as any other resource, is something that is a scarce sort of resource, right? That now attention is being diverted to everything that's going on in this sort of complex web of the Middle East, and that, of course, the United States is by no means focused anymore on even these sort of attempts, and they were truly, questionable to start with, the way that the negotiations were going around Ukraine, Russia, but also now this also being something that's very much on the agenda of European capitals and more broadly those that have been friends and allies of Ukraine. And then on top of this, right, so oil, strategic attention, we have the third very important component, which is actually the supply of munitions and the war material, which is being diverted towards the Middle Eastern theater. Of course, Trump administration hasn't allocated any new resources towards the military aid to Ukraine since coming into office, but still some of the promised things, for instance, those assets that would have potentially been coming to Ukrainian relief through programs like NATO's Pearl, right, where European allies would be buying some of the ground missile defense system and similar are now being very much short in supply because they are the ones that are so highly prized also by the Gulf partners. So in that sense, also Ukraine is being left out on a limb, while at the same time, what we've seen is it trying to assert itself as a party that actually knows and has a proven record of trying to defend, and successfully so. We've seen against Iranian Shahid drones that Russia is now exporting in an upgraded fashion as well to Iran as a kind of war aid, along with providing intelligence and again providing some medical aid and similar. So in that sense, Russia very much enjoying the windfall. I wouldn't say that this is a strategic transformation, but it's a much needed breathing space that it looked for. And then to be very quick, because I know we are sort of very fiercely running out of time here. Briefly on China, I think for China, the story is different because China is a different actor here, of course, and I think there is something to be said about that kind of culture of strategic patience and all that. And I don't want to overly generalize here, but it's certainly enjoying from that kind of opportunistic restraint while exploiting some of the opportunities that are presenting themselves very easily these days, given, again, this sort of strategic distraction that the United States has vis-a-vis different theaters, by primarily the Indo-Pacific theater. So one thing that's really important is that everything that has been going on for China is playing into this narrative that the United States can't be trusted, that US interventionism is causing instability, that American power is increasingly overstretched. And this is potentially for some of those countries in the Indo-Pacific, a kind of alluring narrative at the moment, right, to basically hedge against the uncertainty that's coming out of Washington. And I think that some of the examples we are seeing already as we speak. So last week, we had this news out of the Philippines. I've already mentioned, first country to declare national emergency because of the rising cost of energy. The Philippines have now, for the first time since the beginning of January of last year, opened up bilateral consultations with China, and lo and behold, they will also be conducting preliminary steps towards oil and gas cooperation in South China Sea. So this is a country that has been one of the most vulnerable to Chinese coercion in South China Sea, and now all of a sudden it's coming to the table because, of course, it needs to source that energy somewhere. It needs those partners. So while China might not be a decisive winner at the moment, it definitely is a beneficiary, and it will remain a beneficiary as long as there is this sort of big question mark over, can the United States be trusted by allies and partners? And again, as long as this sort of economic uncertainty continues. And one thing for China, and maybe to wrap up here, it is much better prepared than most around Asia when it comes to diversification of its sources of energy. So while it's being hit, and of course everyone is being hit in the world, it's not being hit as much as some of the others around that region or even here in Europe.
Thank you, Gorana. So if I try to link your global assessment with the regional dynamics we discussed previously, and perhaps focused on China, I would like to bring in Grace and Sanam again. I mean, China has sort of outsourced regional security, the free passage of things to the US for a long time. What's your assessment what this crisis will do to Chinese presence in the Middle East? Is it conceivable that they will change their policies and try to secure these access issues themselves? Or would you expect to stay China a bit on the sidelines as before in observing these regional dynamics and responding to them? Perhaps starting with Sanam.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think this past 3 years has certainly been more tumultuous for the Chinese than they were prepared for. They certainly proved deft at cutting their own sort of side agreements with the Houthis, and obviously they have provided Iran with the low-level economic support. And continue to do so. I think this remains the big question. I don't have a real answer for it. Much depends, again, on how this war ends. If this war ends with no agreement, with more uncertainty, with an expectation that further conflict is inevitable, we could see much more engagement from China, just so that in the short run, they can protect their economic ties and try to insulate themselves from this persistent uncertainty. I think there's probably some thinking taking place in China about basing beyond Djibouti, but it would be far too early to see them make any dramatic moves. And they know very well that they won't be able to really be very present on the Gulf Arab side because of the security dynamics and the balance that Gulf Arab states will continue to need to make between the United States and China. So we might eventually get there. I don't think we'll see anything immediately, but it's a space to watch. Ultimately, I think for most of the region, they would like to see more Chinese engagement diplomatically as well as from a security perspective. But there is a real sense of realism about China's posture and presence in the Middle East. So I'll leave it there.
What's your take on this, Grace?
Yeah, I think my short answer is no. I do not expect a growing Chinese security presence in the region in the near term. But maybe I'll just add a little context and background to why I think that. First of all, let's just put this into a little bit of context. About 40% of China's crude oil imports arrive from the Gulf. Majority comes from Saudi Arabia, and according to 2025 data, about 12% of China's total crude comes from Iran, which constitutes about 80% of Iranian oil exports. Now, my understanding is from this war, comparatively speaking, China is actually relatively well prepared for a short-term decline in crude supply. And that has to do in part with pre-existing stockpiles that offer months of cushions. And also, Sanam mentioned Iran's preparation. We also know that Iran was trying to offload some of its oil in the weeks leading up to conflict, likely because it kind of understood of the conflict coming. The other thing that I think is important to highlight here is Iran is still exporting oil. I have seen figures suggesting that the country is still exporting some 1 million barrels of crude per day, which much of which goes to China through the so-called teapot refineries. With that being said, I was chatting with a contact in Beijing today about China and China's outlook on the war. And he did mention that there's longer term concerns over disruptions to energy supplies. With that being said, it could be that of course leads China to focus more on renewable energy sources. But I don't see a near-term change in China's security presence in the near term in the Middle East for a couple of reasons. The first, which is something that Gorana mentioned, China's primary national security interests remain focused on the Indo-Pacific. And in part, and for the second reason, is that China's ability to differentiate itself from the US, including through rhetoric in the global South, relies on a continued non-interventionist stance. Gorana mentioned this with regard to the current war, but for those of us who were following the Gaza conflict, this was also very much prevalent there. And I also think it's worth noting in the current war, my understanding from Chinese official rhetoric is that even though Iran's retaliatory moves have affected energy outflows, they have been cast in a favorable light as almost kind of an understandable response to an existential crisis that was imposed by Israel and the US. The third reason is a heightened security presence in the region would also challenge China's current regional alignment engagement, which very much focuses on economic engagement, but also, as Sanam mentioned, the ability to engage with a variety of partners. We saw this with the Israelis and the Palestinians. We see this with the Iranis and the Saudis. So I think that it's in China's benefit to continue that. And the fourth and last reason is, I to a certain extent, I think the ambiguous stance that China has taken in the region has worked out so far. When I was working in government, we were working on Operation Prosperity Guardian, obviously the anti-Houthi maritime coalition, and China did not want to partake, and it eventually created its own deal. So I don't see, unless China is very much forced into a position, that it will, out of its own accord, really heighten its security posture in the region in the near term.
All right, so thank you for the second round of a more global perspective. I would now look at some of the questions that got in and ask our panelists to perhaps pick one or two of these questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes before we then finally wrap up. And I would start with a question that I will give to Sanam about Iran, its geography, and 2,400 kilometers of coastline. So the question here is it realistic at all to control the Strait of Hormuz, looking at geography, the vastness of territory that it includes, where you could just with drones do a lot of damage? Or is that not more an aspirational rather than a realistic objective for any further US policy measure? And then to Grace, why was the US not better prepared militarily for a short military operation? What's your assessment of this? What went wrong in the attack planning as the person here framed it? And finally, to Gorana, the scope of diplomacy, the prospect of diplomacy looking from a major power perspective, how realistic would you assess it that there are Russian, Chinese, or any other external power security guarantees to make this sort of compromise agreement go forward? Again, is that more aspirational, or do you see some possibility of finding some common ground here? And I would perhaps start with Sanam again here.
Well, there's a lot of aspiration. I think that the question itself sort of implies skepticism. Obviously, it's a very long and it's a very difficult coastline to control. I would not imagine that the U.S., with such a small array of forces, would be able to control the whole coastline. I think the aim would be to find some solution to open the strait, demine the strait, but not to hold it. I think that is something wholly difficult to achieve with a system of governance that continues to have command and control and retains some degree of its responsive military capacity. In the realm of drones, it's been made known over the past few weeks that the U.S. government was surprised to know how many drones Iran has, maybe up to 50,000, and that there's been some reporting that only about 30% of Iran's missile launchers have been struck. So, I approach this operation with a degree of skepticism and concern because while I understand this would enable President Trump to declare victory and exit from this war, it is very dangerous in terms of cost, and I would imagine that the Iranians, as I said earlier, are prepared for it. So, that's perhaps why there's a delay. That's why the diplomacy door continues to be open. And that's why you're also hearing other sort of discussions, maybe about seizing the HEU, which is equally hard as an operation. It's not sitting, in the south of Iran, easily accessible. If the U.S. actually knows where it is. I would imagine it's in the center of Iran, in Esfahan, or in that vicinity. And there you need air power as well as ground forces, and you've got to dig it out of wherever it was buried last summer. So again, no easy options. And so, that's perhaps explaining the delays and the hesitation. But, it's President Trump, I think right now is very much personally invested in trying to find a win. And it's in these moments that leaders oftentimes don't take the 360 view or the advice of analysts. And we certainly know that this administration has gutted a lot of its expert bureaucracy and is certainly not listening to them. And all of these known unknowns of this war, there's a lot of expertise and capacity in the United States. This war has been war gamed out, and so was the closing of the so-called Strait of Hormuz. So none of this should be too surprising.
That leads us directly to Grace, I guess. If it has been gamed out, why did some things go wrong?
Yeah, no, maybe just very, very briefly on kind of the road to war, because I think it's important when we're, talking about Trump's mindset and trying to kind of get into his thinking. But, I think by the time that the U.S. decided to engage in conflict, there was a perspective or a perception in the White House that, one, Iran was at its weakest since 1979, and two, that Trump had, I think, over the year had gotten increasingly comfortable using military might for what he thought were minimally invasive but highly effective operational campaigns. Now, I think clearly there was, and this is where it kind of, Sanam's comments, I think, are particularly relevant. To what extent those could be applied, that kind of strategy could be applied to Iran, was obviously hugely relevant. And there, I think we need to clearly differentiate also what I think Sanam did very well between like the availability of knowledge and expertise in the governments and the willingness to actually integrate it in operational planning. And that's, I think, where there's clearly been a disconnect here. I think this administration clearly went in with objectives, but not a strategy that was based on any sense of reality. And why do I say that? I think there's three kind of concrete examples that I can name. Firstly, the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, it was clear that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz. Trump knew about this. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, apparently warned Trump that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz. For whatever reason, that was kind of cast aside. Second, the level of Iranian retaliation against U.S. partners in the Gulf. You know, as Sanam also alluded to, there was a reason that in the weeks leading up to conflict, we saw a lot of these leaders come to Washington. There was a concern that a regime that had the perception of being existentially threatened would retaliate in ways in widespread kind of attacks across the region with dire consequences for daily life. And the third one revolves around regime change. I think the perspective that you could kill Ayatollah Khamenei and the regime would fall was not based on any type of analytical reading that I think this White House would have gotten. There was also, I think, it was also widely known that regime change would not be able to be executed by a war that was being conducted from the air alone. And I will also add that this is not just knowledge that was available inside the U.S. government, but also knowledge that was available inside the Israeli government, which is why you saw in the beginning there was a push for the Kurds to get involved. So I think these are just kind of important kind of contexts to kind of understanding how we got to where we are today.
Very insightful. Thank you very much. So this brings us to Gorana and the role of the external major powers also in any potential deal that Trump seems to envisage.
Yeah, a very easy one. But I would say that from where we sit at the moment and how we observe things is that there is at the moment no external actor that combines capability with credibility. And what I mean by this is that if we sort of draw on various sort of theories about how you could get to some sort of negotiated settlement and who would guarantee for that, I don't think that there would be an absence of proposals to kind of work something out. But at the moment, there is an absence of credible guarantors and trusted enforcement mechanisms, simply because we are in a situation now where there would have to be some sort of coalition that would basically say, if the US and Israel renege on the agreement, what would happen as a sort of third party guarantee on that side for Iran willing to settle, right? And as we've heard both from Grace and from Sanam, that sort of escalation ladder still hasn't been exhausted, right? There are still points that Iran can play either by itself or through its proxies. And then, of course, on the Washington side, but in particular on the Israeli side, we probably won't see a likelihood of acceptance of this kind of de-escalation or a deal without some really verifiable limits on Iran's capabilities, on its regional behavior, and the list can go on and on, right, as we've heard from the 15 points. So at the moment where I would say, in the context of a lot of diplomacy in the lead up to all of this happening, right, the military escalation, we've had a lot of diplomacy also being conducted by non-diplomats through very unconventional means, and I'm being very euphemistic when I say that. And again, going to Sanam's points around the hollowing out of the State Department, of the sort of expertise of people who would coordinate the interagency process and so on. All of these are factors that make me less sort of enthusiastic or even sort of having any kind of belief that this would be a deal that would be struck in that fashion. But where there is still a potential for de-escalation is for the US, for President Trump to wake up one day and declare victory on whatever basis or criteria that he would select on that day, and to start disengaging selectively. And then we would just be left with the Israel part of the equation. And then it would really be about sorting out some sort of more informal modus vivendi on how you go about stabilizing the Strait of Hormuz, right, on how we go about securing shipping, on how deterrence looks like in the months and sort of years, I would maybe constrain it 2 months. Again, not to be overly ambitious, but basically to go down that route, because at the moment, again, this sort of route of major power diplomacy is something that, given the US involvement to this extent, is something that I just don't see any external actor being able to kind of mediate or broach.
Thank you. So we have 10 more minutes before I close this session, which leads me to come to some concluding reflections of each of you. But with your permission, I would still combine them with some of more questions that have come in. And we have quite a few questions, Saram, perhaps addressing to you about the role of Saudi Arabia. We have different assessments whether the Crown Prince was actually pushing for escalation or trying to find a de-escalation, advising against the war. And I would perhaps link that to ask about your concluding assessment. There are ideas in our chat that there is a bit of a split between an Islamic coalition of some countries you have mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, and an Abrahamic coalition with the UAE and Israel and others. What do you make of that interpretation of a split? I heard you that you see more of a rapprochement within the GCC, but perhaps if you could combine these ideas I see in the chat with some concluding remarks on your end.
Sure, thank you. So let me just start first with Saudi Arabia. Of course, going into the war, there was reporting from the Wall Street Journal, and then through the course of this war, we've seen a lot of reporting from the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, sorry, and then the Wall Street Journal. And that reporting has been, I think, quite confusing for folks. First of all, obviously, journalists don't have a wide array of contacts. They probably just have one or two. And those stories produced like a lot of news and maybe misunderstanding of Saudi Arabia's posture. I mean, this war, again, wholly unsupported by the kingdom, that is caught in a very difficult position with the other wars in the region. Lebanon continues to rage onwards, and it's the war we're not talking about. There remains unsettled conflict in Yemen. That is, of course, a priority for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There were tensions with the UAE, not just in Yemen, but also Sudan. And ultimately, I think the kingdom is also very worried that Gaza is not being discussed, that the Israeli government continues to pursue policies that make Palestinian statehood unachievable or unattainable at the end of this, all of this. So, there could be a few things going on. Firstly, a bit of, misinformation. I regularly heard from colleagues or friends in the kingdom that this was Israeli sort of propaganda on a daily basis, and that was very sort of consistent through the apogee or the highest peaks of Iranian attacks on the Gulf, that Israel was trying to drag or convince or pressure Gulf countries to enter into the war, not just defensively, but offensively, because optically that would be, of course, very positive for Israel. I think the kingdom obviously is in a dependent position with Washington. It needs to continue to maintain those security relationships. But I don't think that this is a situation that was encouraged by Saudi Arabia. And there have been a lot of debates and twists and turns over the past month in terms of the kingdom's posture, if they would enter. I only see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia becoming overtly involved in this war if there is a huge loss of life in the kingdom through some of these strikes. Or if the Houthis begin to directly start striking Saudi Arabia. So there needs to be some sort of impetus to sort of justify Saudi Arabia's entry, and ultimately they want to focus on their own priorities and not be sort of dragged into what they see as an Israeli war in the Middle East as well. And then to your question on this comes from a colleague of mine who I respect very much, Firas Maqsad, who wrote about this Abrahamic and Islamic sort of coalitions. I don't wholly agree with his analysis here. I think it's reductive, unfortunately, and I've told him as such. Because there aren't Islamic coalitions and they're not Abrahamic coalitions. I think in the Middle East today, the general sort of arrangement of relationships are multi-aligned. It's a reaction to the shifting or fragmenting global order, where obviously conflicts are metastasizing and states are pursuing national interest, transactional, issue-based relationships that are convenient, not based on faith, and not necessarily. They're not all going to make sense. Not everyone is going to be in the same box on everything at the same time. Certainly, there will be a push after this war to continue to expand the so-called Abraham Accords, and President Trump already sort of foreshadowed that was going to try to come back just a few days ago with not particularly positive remarks about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But I think that most Arab countries in the Middle East are going to be quite cautious about such alignments. Ultimately, they're looking to prioritize their economic security, their security arrangements with Washington, but also their relations with China. And the best way to do that is to form issue-based sort of mini-lateral arrangements, like you're seeing between the four countries pursuing diplomacy, but there are many other examples as well.
Thank you. So quite a few questions relate to the sort of a prognosis of where we're going from here. And perhaps, Grace, if you could also assemble your closing remarks a bit from a more Israeli perspective, together perhaps with the US perspective. We haven't talked about Israel a lot. It's fighting longer wars than it used to in previous decades. Many say it's heading towards regional hegemony, but if it doesn't manage to achieve its objectives, its war objectives, there's quite a debate of where Israel is heading. I'll leave it to you how you want to end this, but if you could take one Israeli perspective into your concluding remark, that's appreciated.
Sure, I'm happy to kind of close with Israel. So, as you mentioned, Israel has been conducting perpetual warfare since 2023 on 6 different fronts, and has been engaged in heightened warfare in Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iran. And I think it's fairly clear when we look at the picture today that none of Israel's military operations have really led to longer-term strategic wins or contributed to true stability and peace for either Israel or its neighbors. And I think in part this has to do with Israel's security doctrine, particularly post-October 2023, which is much more focused on force-induced prevention and management of perceived threats than on a clear strategy on how that might contribute to longer-term regional stability, which I think requires a much clearer and more deliberate political process. With that being said, obviously, for those of us who are watching Israel is heading into election season later this year. And so we are seeing some signs of concern over Israel's ongoing multi-front warfare from Israel's opposition. So, we haven't focused on Hezbollah and Lebanon too much today, but the IDF is obviously pushing deep into Lebanon. The IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, has the Defense Secretary, Katz, has mentioned that that the Litani River should become almost a new buffer zone for Israel. But with that said, the opposition is showing more concern about what that means. So just a couple of days ago, opposition leader Yair Lapid warned that the IDF is being overstretched. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that the government is now winning nowhere, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, and not in Iran. With that being said, I think I need to add a critical side note, which is that there still appears to be broad political and popular support for the military aims, particularly of this war. And I'm not really seeing, looking across Israeli society, a coherent alternative non-military strategy being put forward. We're almost at time, but maybe just very, very briefly on plausible trajectories for the war in Iran from the US perspective. I think the Trumpiest of options, which was initially put forward in the very early days of the war, essentially Trump just saying, I've won, we're leaving. I think that's, and I've clearly also won an option that we saw play out in June of last year when Trump, sort of directed Israeli jets mid-air to stop their attack on Iran and unilaterally declared a ceasefire. I don't see that option happening here because of, the reasons that were laid out by my colleagues on Iran needing to kind of reestablish deterrence for the longer term. The other thing that I don't see as likely in the near term is a long-term ground operation, and that's just by looking at troop numbers. As I mentioned, there's about 50,000 troops in the U.S. troops in the region now. If you look at major operations in Iraq in 2007, there were about 160,000 troops. In Afghanistan in 2011, about 100,000 troops. So I don't see that. Of course, troops can be ramped up, but I don't see that happening in the near term. But I do think there's particular outcomes, and I'll just close here, that the U.S. will try to sell as a victory. I think these are much more tactical, and one of those would be kind of a coerced and temporary freeze of the conflict that the U.S. might sell as a tactical success. So Iran's military and production capacity is severely reduced in the short to medium term, which allows the U.S. to extract itself from the conflict. So that's one potential scenario that I foresee. I can go on, but just in the interest of time, I will leave it there.
Thank you, Grace. I'm aware that I'm a little behind time, so we will run about 5 minutes late, but I would like to give Gorana an opportunity for her final thoughts. I have questions on potential roles for Switzerland, but I leave it to you whether you want to take them up. But any thought you would like to share on further likely trajectories at this stage?
Yeah, we would have to turn tables here, so I can ask you, what do you think Switzerland's role in all of this could be, or the implications and fallout? Look, I don't want to take too much time. I think a lot has already been said, and colleagues are, of course, experts on both sides of this dyad. So I wouldn't weigh into that, but maybe as some closing remarks, we've heard a lot of Machiavelli being floated around over the past couple of weeks, when with the wars beginning when you will, but they don't necessarily end when you please, right? And this sort of illusion of control is something that we are dealing with because we are now in a situation where we are really left wondering about the next steps in terms of the escalation or de-escalation ladder, and that's not a very comfortable space to be in if you're an analyst in any of the capitals of some of the countries that we've already alluded to that are really needing to deal with the fallout. From my sort of side of the kind of analysis and kind of observation, what this confirms to me yet again is this sort of interconnectedness of global security and theaters where basically this has huge ripple effects in terms of the security and kind of regional balance from the Euro-Atlantic into the Indo-Pacific because of diverted resources, diverted political attention, and just this sort of prioritization of the crisis at hand, which again seems to not be easily resolved. The second thing that we haven't discussed as much is the potentially very long tail of economic consequences, even if this war ended tomorrow, right? Because of the physical and infrastructure damage that will certainly be sort of translated into how supply chains work or don't work. And we are talking from everything about, not just hydrocarbons, from fertilizers to semiconductors. There are a lot of things going around now, like less party balloons, right? Like shorter showers in South Korea. All of this is connected, and we need to appreciate that. But also what that then does in terms of government interventionism, in terms of competition for supply of particular critical goods. Again, not unlike to what we've seen just a couple of years ago with the onset of the pandemic. And then moving forward, are we looking at a world that's going to be increasingly economically disruptive without the formal resolution? And will this just bring in just higher price and risk premium into all of our transactions, right, with the declining multilateralism, which has been the sort of background? And then one final thing, and this I don't know the answer to yet. There can be reasons to be cheerful and reasons to be less cheerful. Conversations about fossil fuels, in general, right? So I'll start with less cheerful. The fact that we've seen now a lot of countries across Asia converting basically to coal and starting to think even about extraction of oil from coal and what this means, again, to reaching some of the net emissions targets and so on. But then on the other hand, what I've seen a lot is also an accelerated conversation, and this is the reason to be cheerful. If you want to see a kind of more decarbonized world, will this lead to basically a lot more and a sort of stronger push towards getting to more renewable and sustainable energy sources down the line, given the vulnerability and again the potential, which again we've heard from both colleagues, could actually be even more at risk with some of these supply routes being threatened even further or being just kind of a target of aggression. And I'll leave it there. So at least some optimism for the end in some countries.
A very apt conclusion, I would say, which leaves me to thank all our panelists, Dr. Sanam Vakil, Dr. Grace Mermenbol, and Dr. Gorana Girgic, for what I think was a very rich tour d'horizon, assessing different dynamics, levels of analysis of this conflict. We are very grateful that you have invested this time, and I think I can thank you on behalf of all the audience in this web talk. I would also like to thank the CSS communications team that has made this talk possible, has done a lot of work in the background. And if you are interested in learning more about CSS events, we have an event newsletter where you can subscribe to on our webpage at ETH Zurich. And as for now, all for me that remains to be done is to wish you a good evening, or wherever you are, a good morning, a good afternoon. I'm closing this exchange with our best regards from ETH Zurich. Thank you very much.